Jason Hamilton stood in front of the mirror adjusting his tie as the sunlight poured through the expansive windows of his penthouse, the city skyline glittering in the distance, his reflection a sharp contrast to the warmth of the world outside. He was a man who had it all wealth power status, yet something was missing, a feeling he couldn't quite place but knew existed deep inside him. Claire, his wife, stood behind him. Their marriage had been built on love and mutual respect. From the moment they had met in college, she had always been his rock. Her soft smile had kept him grounded, while his ambition propelled him forward. But now, as he looked at her, he wondered if it was all enough. She had stood by him through countless sleepless nights and endless deals, pushing him to be the best version of himself. But lately their relationship felt like it was on autopilot. Claire had become more distant to him in ways that were subtle but undeniable. She wasn't the same woman he had married years ago. The fire in her eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet contentment. He no longer knew how to connect with. They had drifted apart over time, not with grand gestures, but with little moments that added up. The nights spent alone in different rooms, the lack of conversation that was once so natural between them. Now only small talk filled the spaces between them. But Jason couldn't put his finger on when it all changed. It had just happened, slowly, like the fading of a sunset. He tried to ignore it, convincing himself that it was just a phase, something that would pass with time, but deep down, he knew that something had shifted. The phone buzzed on the table, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Megan, the young woman he had met at a tech conference several months ago. Her excitement and energy had been intoxicating. Megan was everything Claire wasn't. She was full of life and passion, the kind of person who made Jason feel alive again. For the first time in years, he found himself looking forward to their conversations. They talked for hours about business ideas, dreams, and the future in ways that made him feel young again. Something about her made him feel seen in a way he hadn't felt in years. He didn't expect this kind of connection, not when he had Claire at home, but the pull toward Megan was undeniable. She was the spark he hadn't realized he'd been missing. When Jason looked back at Claire, she was standing by the window, gazing out at the city, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, her back turned to him. But there was something in her posture, a quiet resignation, that made him feel guilty, and yet at the same time restless. Megan's messages had become a constant distraction in his mind. Every word from her felt like a thread, pulling him away from the life he had built with Claire. Claire was still in the background, her presence a gentle reminder of everything he had and everything he might lose. But the allure of something new was powerful. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, and as he stood there, he realized that the life he had with Claire no longer felt like the future he wanted, but the past he couldn't escape. Jason paced around his penthouse that evening, unable to focus on anything for long. His mind kept drifting back to Megan, to the messages they had exchanged earlier in the day, full of energy and enthusiasm. She had a way of pulling him into her world, a world that felt so different from the life he had with Claire. He could feel the temptation growing stronger, a voice inside him telling him that it was time for a change, time for something new. But he knew it would come at a cost. Claire had always been patient, always understanding, but as Jason watched her move through their home that night, he saw a woman who was quietly fading. Her laughter was less frequent, her smiles less genuine. He knew she had noticed the change in him. How could she not? They had stopped talking in the way they once had. Their conversations were shallow now, filled with polite exchanges rather than deep, meaningful connections. There was a wall between them, built slowly over the years, and Jason wasn't sure how to tear it down. He tried to focus on work, burying himself in emails and reports, but his thoughts kept wandering back to Megan. She was everything that Claire wasn't: young, free-spirited, and full of ambition. She was driven in a way that Claire hadn't been in years. Jason's business empire had grown, but in many ways, Claire had become comfortable, content with the life they had built together, while Jason was still chasing something more, something exciting, something that made him feel alive. The decision was weighing on him heavily, but Jason couldn't ignore the pull. That night, he made up his mind. He needed to talk to Claire. He couldn't keep living in this limbo, pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. Megan's presence in his life had become too significant to ignore, and if he was going to make a choice, he needed to be honest with himself and with Claire. The next morning, Claire sat at the breakfast table, her eyes scanning over the news on her tablet. She didn't seem to notice Jason's tense silence as he sat down across from her. For the first time in a long while, he couldn't bring himself to initiate a conversation. Claire's presence was familiar, comforting even, but it felt more like a reminder of everything he was walking away from than something he wanted to hold on to. "Claire," Jason said, his voice low, breaking the silence. She glanced up at him, her eyes tired, as if she had been expecting this moment, but had hoped it would never come. Jason hesitated, unsure of how to begin, but the words tumbled out before he could stop them. "I think we need to talk." Claire set down her tablet, her gaze steady, but there was an unmistakable sadness in her eyes. "About what?" "I'm not happy anymore," Jason admitted, his heart pounding. "I don't think I've been happy for a while." Claire didn't flinch, but her expression softened. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jason looked at her, surprised. "You knew?" Claire nodded slowly. "I've known for months, Jason. I've felt it. You've been distant, cold. I saw how you were with Megan." Jason felt his chest tighten. He had hoped that Claire wouldn't know, that he could somehow escape the guilt of his actions, but she had always been so intuitive. He had taken her for granted, and now the truth was undeniable. "I never wanted to hurt you, Claire," he said, his voice faltering. "But I've been trying to figure out who I am, what I want. And now you know." Claire asked softly, her eyes never leaving his. Jason nodded, the weight of his decision settling on his shoulders. "I'm leaving," he said simply. "I'm sorry. I think I need to be with Megan." The words felt final, like a door closing behind him, but he knew there was no turning back. Claire sat still, processing the information, her face unreadable. After a long silence, she finally spoke. "Then go, Jason, but don't expect me to wait for you." She stood up, walking toward the door. Jason's heart broke as he watched her leave, but in that moment, he knew there was no other choice. The path he had chosen was irreversible, and everything he had once known was slipping away. Jason stood in the empty kitchen, the quiet of the apartment pressing in on him. Claire's absence felt like a physical weight, heavier than anything he had ever experienced. He had made the choice, and now there was no turning back. The finality of it all sunk in, and with it came a wave of guilt he hadn't anticipated. He stared at the untouched cup of coffee Claire had left behind, the steam long gone. Everything about this moment was cold, distant, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he had lost something far more important than he realized. But Megan's face, her infectious smile, and the way she made him feel young again, dominated his thoughts. It was supposed to be what he wanted, wasn't it? A fresh start, a life of excitement and energy. No more stagnation, no more feeling like he was trapped in a relationship that no longer made sense. Yet in the silence of his penthouse, Jason felt the echoes of his former life haunting him. Megan called that afternoon, her voice upbeat and full of life, as if nothing had changed. She had been waiting for him to make this move, to finally leave the past behind and fully embrace the future with her. She invited him to a dinner at one of the trendiest restaurants in the city, a place that buzzed with the kind of energy Jason had grown to crave. When he arrived, Megan was already there, looking effortlessly glamorous, the very picture of youth and ambition. She flashed him a grin as soon as she saw him, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Finally, Jason. I knew you'd come around," Megan said, her voice almost teasing as she reached for his hand. Jason smiled back, but something in his chest tightened. He had chosen this life, this new, exciting chapter, but it didn't feel as liberating as he had imagined. They sat down to dinner, and as they ate, the conversation flowed easily, just like it always did. Megan was charming and witty, and Jason found himself laughing, drawn into her world. It was a world he had never fully understood, but had always longed to be a part of. She was confident, self-assured, and unafraid to go after what she wanted. She pushed him to be better, to live with more intensity than he had ever done before. But as the evening wore on, the weight of his earlier conversation with Claire lingered in the back of his mind. He couldn't shake the image of her standing in the doorway, her face stoic as she said goodbye. The guilt gnawed at him, an unspoken reminder that he had left something real behind for something that felt temporary. His thoughts flickered back to Claire's quiet acceptance of his decision. She had known. She had seen it coming, and yet she hadn't fought for him. Maybe she had already known that there was no way to keep him anymore. Jason's phone buzzed, snapping him out of his reverie. It was a message from Claire's assistant, confirming that she had been booked for an important design project in another city. Jason paused, staring at the message. Claire was moving on. She was building a life for herself without him, just as he had hoped she would. And yet, a part of him, something deep inside, longed for her presence again. Megan leaned across the table, breaking his train of thought. "You're awfully quiet tonight," she remarked, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied him. "Something on your mind?" Jason forced a smile, pushing the thought of Claire aside. "No, just thinking," he said, trying to sound casual. "I'm happy we're finally together, Megan. This feels right." She grinned and leaned in closer. "I knew you'd come to your senses." But as the night wore on, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how perfect things seemed with Megan, the emptiness inside him was growing. The walls of his luxurious life, filled with success and admiration, felt cold and hollow. He had escaped one life only to find himself standing at the edge of another, unsure of what lay ahead, but already beginning to question whether it was truly the future he had wanted. Months passed, and Jason found himself living a life that he had once imagined would be everything he wanted. He and Megan had become a fixture in the city's social scene, their faces appearing in glossy magazines and on the covers of business magazines. They attended exclusive events, rubbed shoulders with celebrities and other billionaires, and traveled to the world's most luxurious destinations. Jason's business empire continued to grow at an exponential rate, and Megan, ever the ambitious partner, pushed him to reach even greater heights. It was a life of excess, a life he had once thought would fill the void that had grown between him and Claire. But as the months went by, something began to gnaw at Jason. He couldn't shake the feeling of isolation, a loneliness that crept in during the quiet moments when the world around him was still. He had traded one kind of life for another, but both felt hollow. Megan's energy, while intoxicating, was also exhausting. She was constantly pushing him, always demanding more of his time and attention, never satisfied with the success they had achieved. The spark between them was undeniable, but it was also wearing thin, and Jason couldn't ignore the growing disconnect between them. It wasn't just Megan. Something in him was changing, something he couldn't ignore anymore. Despite everything they had together, Jason found himself thinking about Claire. It was inevitable. He had tried to push those thoughts to the back of his mind, but they resurfaced again and again. Claire had been his constant, his rock, the one who had been there for him through thick and thin. Even after everything had fallen apart between them, even as he found new ways to drown himself in Megan's world, he couldn't escape the memories of the life he had once shared with Claire. Her calm demeanor, her unwavering support, it had been so different from the chaos that now surrounded him. Jason's guilt grew heavier with each passing day. Claire had moved on with her life in ways that Jason hadn't fully realized at the time. She had rebuilt herself, pursuing her own career in interior design, something she had always been passionate about but had put on hold during their marriage. She had grown stronger, more independent. Jason had assumed she would crumble after their divorce, but instead, she had found a new sense of purpose, a new direction. And now he was left to confront the truth. He had walked away from someone who had been nothing but supportive, someone who had given him everything, only to leave her for the illusion of something better. The worst part, though, was the uncertainty. He had severed ties with Claire, believing that a new relationship would give him the happiness he sought. But the emptiness remained. He had taken the path of least resistance, chasing after a fleeting connection with Megan, but now it felt more like an escape than anything else. Megan was everything he thought he wanted, but she wasn't the person who had truly understood him, who had helped shape him into the man he was. One afternoon, after another argument with Megan about his lack of focus on their future together, Jason found himself staring at the photos from the life he had left behind. It was a picture from their last family vacation, Claire smiling beside him, her eyes bright with love. the children they had talked about building a future with, the family he had abandoned in search of something else. Jason closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the decision he had made. The empire, the fame, the money, they all felt like empty trophies. He had chased them for so long, but now they seemed irrelevant. What he really wanted, what he needed, was something more. And for the first time since leaving Claire, Jason wondered if it was too late to fix what he had broken. Megan walked in at that moment, her voice sharp with frustration. "Jason, we need to talk about our future. You can't keep living in the past." But Jason wasn't listening. His mind was elsewhere, lost in a sea of regret and longing for a life he had once taken for granted. Jason's mind raced as he sat there, staring at the floor while Megan's words echoed in his ears. But it wasn't Megan he was thinking about, it was Claire. The woman he had left behind, the woman he had believed he could walk away from, the one who had always been there for him. The emptiness inside him deepened with each passing moment as he thought about her, about what he had lost. Megan, noticing his lack of response, stepped closer, her voice growing impatient. "Jason, do you even hear me? We've talked about this. Your work, your priorities. You can't keep drifting between two worlds." Jason snapped back to reality, forcing himself to focus on Megan, but it was impossible to ignore the heaviness in his chest. He had been so sure, so confident that leaving Claire for Megan would bring him the fulfillment he'd been missing. Yet now that he was here, in the life he had created, he felt nothing but confusion and regret. "I hear you," Jason replied, his voice strained. "But I can't shake the feeling that something's missing. I don't know if this is the life I thought it would be." Megan's eyes narrowed, sensing the shift in his tone. She stepped back slightly, crossing her arms. "What are you saying, Jason?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair, trying to find the right words. "I thought I could leave everything behind, leave Claire, leave the past, and move on. But I can't. There's this void, and it's growing. I've tried to ignore it, but it's becoming impossible to do so." Megan's face hardened. "So what? You're telling me this was all a mistake?" Jason didn't know how to answer. "I'm not saying it's a mistake. I don't think I was ready for what I left behind. I thought I could find happiness with you, Megan, but now it feels like I'm just running from something." Megan scoffed, her frustration palpable. "So, you're telling me that after everything we've been through, after all the dreams we've built together, you're suddenly thinking about your ex-wife? Are you kidding me, Jason?" Jason opened his mouth, but before he could speak, Megan was already turning away from him, heading toward the door. "I don't have time for this. If you can't see what we have, then maybe we're not meant to be. I don't need someone who's constantly looking over their shoulder at their past. I need a partner who's fully here with me. If you're not that person, then I'm done." Jason watched her leave, the finality of her words sinking deep into him. The apartment, once filled with the excitement of his new life, suddenly felt cold and lifeless. He hadn't meant for things to go this way. He hadn't meant to hurt Megan, but it had become clear that the life he had built was no longer what he truly wanted. The truth had become undeniable. He had been so focused on escaping his past with Claire, on finding something better, something more exciting, that he had never stopped to reflect on what really mattered. The empire, the fame, the luxury. None of it had ever been what he truly needed. What he had needed, what he had lost, was the simple connection he had once shared with Claire. The life they had built together, their quiet moments of shared love and mutual understanding, had been far more fulfilling than the glittering distractions of his new world. Jason found himself standing in the middle of the empty apartment, feeling more alone than he had ever felt. His phone buzzed on the table, and he glanced at it. It was a message from Claire's assistant, asking if he wanted to reschedule a meeting for a business project they had been working on together. Jason stared at the message for a moment, feeling a pang of regret. Claire was moving forward with her life, and he was standing still in a world he no longer recognized. With a heavy heart, Jason knew what he had to do. He had made his choice years ago, and now it was time to face the consequences of it. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to fix things with Claire. Maybe he could go back and find a way to rebuild what he had so recklessly destroyed. The thought brought a flicker of hope to his chest, but it was still unclear whether Claire would ever be willing to take him back. The journey to repair their fractured relationship seemed impossible, but it was the only thing that felt right now. Jason had no idea how it would all play out, but he knew one thing for sure. He had to try. Jason didn't waste any time. The very next morning, he found himself standing outside Claire's new design studio, his hands clammy and his heart pounding. The world outside was busy, people rushing by as he stood frozen, uncertain of what would happen next. He hadn't seen her in months, not in person, not since the painful goodbye he had once thought was the end. Yet, standing here now, he realized it was just the beginning of something far more complicated than he could have imagined. Taking a deep breath, Jason pushed open the door and walked inside. The scent of fresh paint and new furniture greeted him, a reminder of how far Claire had come since their split. Her studio was immaculate, the walls lined with vibrant design samples, and soft music played in the background. It was also different from the sterile, cold office spaces he was used to. This was Claire's world now, a world built on her passion and creativity. She looked up from the drawing table as he entered, her eyes briefly widening in surprise. There was a flicker of recognition in her gaze, but it quickly gave way to caution. Claire had changed in the months since they last saw each other. Her posture was more confident, her smile more reserved, and the softness that had once defined her seemed tempered with a quiet strength. She no longer looked like the woman he had taken for granted. She had become something more, something he realized he wanted back. "Jason," Claire said, her voice neutral, almost distant. "What are you doing here?" I needed to see you," Jason replied, his voice unsteady. He hadn't planned his words, but they felt true. He needed to explain himself, to somehow bridge the chasm he had created between them. Claire didn't respond right away. She simply stood there, her arms crossed, waiting for him to continue. It felt like a lifetime ago that they had stood together, partners in everything, building a life they both believed in. Now there was only silence, a quiet gap between them that no amount of words seemed capable of closing. "I know I hurt you," Jason said, his throat tight with emotion. "I made the biggest mistake of my life, and I've spent every day regretting it. I thought leaving you behind was the answer, but I was wrong. I see that now." Claire's expression softened slightly, but her eyes were guarded. "You made your choice, Jason," she said quietly. "You walked away from me, and you built a life without me." I know, Jason admitted, his voice barely a whisper, but it wasn't the life I wanted. I thought I needed excitement. I thought I needed something different, but I was wrong. What I needed was you, your steady presence, your love, your support. I've realized that now. I've spent months trying to fill a void with things that don't matter. And the more I tried to escape from what we had, the more I realized it was the only thing that really mattered. Claire took a step back, her gaze never leaving his. Jason could see the wheels turning in her mind, the hesitation, the hurt, and the disbelief. She had moved on with her life, and Jason had no right to expect her to just accept him back. He knew he had destroyed something precious between them, and it wasn't something that could be fixed with a few words. "I can't just forget everything that happened, Jason," Claire said, her voice tinged with sadness. "You left me. You left everything behind, and now you expect me to welcome you back as if nothing changed." Jason nodded slowly, his heart heavy with regret. "I don't expect you to forget. I know I can't undo the past, but I'm asking for another chance, a chance to prove that I've learned from my mistakes, that I can be the man you deserve. I don't expect things to be the same, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right." Claire was silent for a long moment, her eyes studying him, searching for sincerity. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "I don't know if we can go back to what we had, Jason," she said softly. "I don't know if I can trust you again, but I don't want to close the door completely." Jason's heart leaped. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. It was a sliver of hope, a crack in the wall he had built between them. He would have to prove himself, prove that he was worthy of her trust again, but that was something he was willing to fight for. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said, his voice steady now, full of determination. "I'm not giving up on us, Claire. not this time. She nodded, her gaze softening just a little, as if considering his words. We'll see, Jason, but it's going to take time. Jason didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, he felt a flicker of hope for the first time in a long while. He wasn't sure if Claire would ever fully forgive him, but he knew that he couldn't live with the regret of never trying. And maybe, just maybe, he could find his way back to the woman who had always been the love of his life. The weeks that followed were filled with a mix of cautious optimism and lingering uncertainty. Jason had never felt more vulnerable in his life, but he also knew that this was the only way forward. Every day he showed up, whether it was dropping by Claire's studio with lunch, sending thoughtful messages, or simply offering his support in ways he hadn't before. He knew that words alone wouldn't fix everything. He had to prove his sincerity with actions. Claire, for her part, remained guarded. She had softened, yes, but the scars of the past were still there. She wasn't ready to trust him completely, and Jason understood. He couldn't expect her to forget the pain he had caused just because he had realized the mistake he made. Still, he could sense the subtle shifts, the way she would smile more when he was around, or how her walls would lower just a fraction when they spoke about their shared past. It was slow, but it was progress. Megan, however, had not taken kindly to Jason's new path. She had heard whispers about his attempts to reconnect with Claire, and when Jason received a message from her one evening, he knew a confrontation was inevitable. He was at Claire's studio when his phone buzzed. The message from Megan was brief but pointed. Asterisk, we need to talk, Jason. This thing with Claire, it's over, asterisk. Jason stared at the screen, his stomach sinking. He had expected this to come at some point. Megan had always been someone who demanded his undivided attention and loyalty, but seeing it in writing felt like a slap in the face. He had tried to tell himself that Megan wasn't the person he was supposed to be with, but part of him still felt guilty for the way things had turned out. Yet the truth was clear. He had made a choice to rebuild with Claire, and if that meant facing the end of his relationship with Megan, then so be it. He called Megan immediately, trying to explain, but she picked up with an icy tone. Don't bother, Jason. I've had enough of this. You can't keep your mind in two places at once, and I won't be second to anyone. I've given you everything, and I won't be your backup plan when it suits you. Jason tried to keep his voice steady. Megan, it's not like that. I realized that I've made a mess of things. I thought I could have it all, but I was wrong. This isn't about you or me anymore. It's about trying to make things right with Claire. I'm not asking for forgiveness, but I need to do this. There was a pause on the other end. Then Megan's voice came through, laced with bitterness. Don't contact me again, Jason. You've made your choice. The call ended and Jason's heart sank. He knew it was over with Megan, and despite how he had wanted to avoid it, he also felt a sense of relief. The choice had been made, and now he could focus on what truly mattered. But even then, the weight of what he had left behind lingered. Later that evening, Jason returned to Claire's studio. She was in the middle of a design mock-up when he stepped inside. There was a moment of quiet tension before she looked up, sensing something was different. Jason stood in the doorway, feeling the sting of his own guilt mixed with the hope of a future he couldn't yet fully see. I got a message from Megan, he said, his voice quiet. Claire looked up from her work, her expression unreadable. And Jason exhaled, the words feeling heavier than they should. It's over. She knows what I'm doing, and she's made it clear that she won't be part of my life anymore. Claire nodded slowly, absorbing the news. She didn't say anything for a long time, her gaze distant, as though processing something she had long kept inside. Jason waited, unsure of what her response would be. When she finally spoke, it wasn't with anger or frustration. It was simply with a quiet understanding. I'm not asking you to forget the past, Jason, Claire said softly, her eyes meeting his. But you've made your choice, and I want you to understand that while I'm willing to see where this goes, there are no guarantees. We can't just pick up where we left off. You broke my trust. Jason nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. I know, and I don't expect you to just forgive me, Claire. I'll earn it every step of the way. I don't want to lose you again. I can't. For the first time in months, Claire smiled faintly. It wasn't the smile of a woman who had fully forgiven him, but it was the smile of someone who was beginning to believe in the possibility of something new, something better. "I'm not sure what will happen, Jason," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But we'll take it one step at a time. And if you're serious about this, we'll see where it goes." Jason's heart lifted slightly as he took a step closer to her. "One step at a time," he repeated, the words feeling like the first true hope he had felt in a long time. It wasn't a promise of perfection, but it was a chance he was willing to fight for. Months passed, and Jason's relationship with Claire evolved slowly but steadily. They took things one day at a time, and the distance between them, once filled with bitterness and regret, began to fade. Jason knew that rebuilding trust wasn't going to happen overnight, but he was committed. Every little step, every shared moment felt like a victory, even if it was just sitting together in the quiet of Claire's studio or walking through the park as they talked about life, the future, and their children. The road to healing wasn't without its challenges. There were moments when old wounds resurfaced, times when Jason's past mistakes seemed too heavy to bear. But he refused to give up, and Claire, while still cautious, could see the sincerity in his efforts. They didn't rush into anything. They took their time, allowing the foundation of their relationship to rebuild itself from the ground up. Then, one late afternoon, as Jason walked into Claire's studio after a meeting, he found her sitting at her desk, staring at a small envelope in her hands. Her face was unreadable, her brow furrowed as she turned the envelope over and over. The moment Jason stepped inside, she glanced up, her expression unreadable. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice filled with a quiet concern. He had learned over the months to read the subtle cues that Claire gave off, and something about the way she was holding that envelope made him uneasy. Claire nodded slowly, though she didn't smile. It's from my doctor, my checkup results." Jason's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't known what kind of checkup she had been going for, but the way she was acting, the uncertainty in her eyes, made him realize this wasn't just any routine appointment. "What's wrong, Claire?" he asked, stepping closer to her. She exhaled slowly, her hands shaking slightly as she opened the envelope. She scanned the letter, then paused, her eyes welling up with emotion. Jason's chest tightened as he waited for her to say something. His mind raced through every possible scenario. Jason, I don't know how to say this," Claire finally said, her voice wavering. "I'm pregnant, and not just with one baby." Jason felt the world stand still for a moment. The words didn't immediately make sense. Pregnant, and with more than one child. The weight of her words hung in the air between them. He stared at her, disbelief clouding his thoughts. "Pregnant? You're having a baby." She nodded, her lips trembling. "Actually, it's more than one. I'm having quadruplets." Jason's heart raced. The reality of her words sank in slowly. His mind swirled with emotions, shock, joy, confusion, and a deep, overwhelming sense of responsibility. Quadruplets. That meant 4 children, 4 lives that would change everything. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Jason's mind tried to process the information, to grasp the weight of it. He had always imagined a future with Claire, though he had never expected it to come with so many new, unexpected challenges. He had hoped to rebuild his place in her life, but this was a whole new beginning. Are you okay?" Jason asked, his voice soft but filled with concern. Claire smiled faintly, though the tears still lingered in her eyes. "I'm scared, Jason, but I'm also excited. I never thought I'd be here, especially not after everything that happened between us." Jason reached for her hand, gently squeezing it. "You don't have to do this alone, Claire. I'm here all in. I know I've made mistakes, but I'm not going anywhere. We're in this together." Claire looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for sincerity. Slowly, a small smile began to form on her lips. "I want to believe that, Jason. I want to believe that we can do this together." And just like that, a sense of calm settled over him. Jason had made many mistakes in his life, but one thing was certain now. He would do whatever it took to make things right, to be the father and partner Claire deserved. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about their future, their children, and the family they were about to create together. As the evening wore on, Jason stayed by her side, helping her make calls to family and friends, preparing for the unexpected joy that was about to enter their lives. They were no longer the same people who had parted ways so long ago, and the path forward would be challenging. But in that moment, Jason knew one thing for certain. He was ready for whatever came next, because this time he wasn't running away. He was home. And this was just the beginning of their new life together.